In the winter of 1887, a construction crew renovating the foundation of an abandoned Catholic orphanage in rural Pennsylvania made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Beneath the floorboards of what had once been the dining hall, they found 93 small wooden crosses, each carved with a child's name and a date spanning from 1834 to 1851. What made this discovery truly disturbing wasn't just the number of crosses, but the fact that according to church records, Santa Eulalia Orphanage had housed exactly 93 children during its 17-year operation. The workers immediately contacted the local authorities, but before any investigation could begin, representatives from the Diocese of Philadelphia arrived and confiscated all evidence, claiming it was sensitive church property. The construction was halted, the building was demolished within a week, and the workers were paid substantial sums to sign agreements never to speak of what they'd found. For over a century, the truth about Santa Eulalia Orphanage has remained buried, but recently discovered letters and testimonies reveal a story so disturbing that it challenges everything we thought we knew about religious charity in 19th century America. Before we continue with the story of Santa Eulalia Orphanage, this channel isn't for everyone. Only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the darkest mysteries hidden in America's religious history. Few channels dare to tell the stories we tell here, stories that reveal the shadows behind sacred walls. If you have the courage to hear the truth about what happened to those 93 children, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Are you brave enough to face the horrors that religious institutions have tried to keep buried for generations? The truth about Santa Eulalia begins in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, where the faithful believed they were witnessing God's work, but were actually funding something far more sinister. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, in the 1830s, was a town of barely 300 souls, nestled in the rolling hills of Lancaster County, where German immigrants had settled generations before. The community was predominantly Lutheran and Reformed, with a small but growing Catholic population that had arrived with the Irish railroad workers who'd stayed after the Pennsylvania Railroad pushed through in 1832. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, where church bells marked the rhythm of daily life, and where the sight of orphaned children begging on the streets had become an uncomfortable reminder of the industrial age's harsh realities. The Catholic community, led by Father Heinrich Kellermann, a stern Bavarian priest with piercing blue eyes and a reputation for unwavering discipline, had been struggling to establish their presence in this Protestant stronghold. Father Kellermann had arrived in Millbrook in 1833 with ambitious plans to build not just a church, but an entire complex that would serve the spiritual and social needs of his growing flock. He was a man of considerable education, having studied theology in Munich before immigrating to America, and he possessed a charismatic ability to inspire both devotion and fear in equal measure. The idea for Santa Eulalia Orphanage came to Father Kellermann during a particularly harsh winter when he witnessed several homeless children freezing in the town square. He saw an opportunity not just to serve God, but to demonstrate Catholic charity to the skeptical Protestant majority. Within months, he had raised enough funds from wealthy Catholic benefactors in Philadelphia to purchase a large Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, an imposing 3-story structure with tall windows and a wraparound porch that had belonged to a failed textile merchant. The townspeople watched with curiosity as Father Kellermann transformed the mansion into what he called a beacon of Catholic compassion. He hired skilled craftsmen to install a chapel in the east wing, convert the large drawing rooms into dormitories, and build a separate kitchen and dining facility. The most striking addition was a tall bell tower that rose from the center of the building, its bronze bell cast in Germany and inscribed with the words, Laudate Dominum, Praise the Lord. Sister Margaret Clare, an Irish nun from the Sisters of Mercy, arrived in the spring of 1834 to serve as the orphanage's director. She was a woman of perhaps 40 years, with prematurely grey hair and hands that bore the calluses of hard work. Those who met her described her as having kind eyes, but a mouth that rarely smiled, and she spoke with the authority of someone who had spent her life caring for forgotten children. She brought with her two younger nuns, Sister Bernadette and Sister Catherine, both in their 20s and eager to serve in what they believed would be a noble mission. The orphanage officially opened its doors on June 15, 1834, with a ceremony attended by nearly the entire town. Protestant and Catholic families alike came to witness what the local newspaper called a shining example of Christian charity. Father Kellerman delivered a passionate sermon about the sacred duty to care for the least among us, while Sister Margaret Clare stood silently beside him, her hands folded in prayer, her face a mask of serene determination. The first children arrived within days. Siblings whose parents had died in a factory accident, a young girl abandoned by a traveling performer, boys who had been living as pickpockets in Philadelphia's streets. The Catholic community embraced the project with unprecedented enthusiasm, organizing fundraisers, donating clothing and food, and volunteering their time to help with the daily operations. Even some Protestant families, moved by the obvious need, contributed to the cause. But from the very beginning, there were whispers about the strict discipline maintained within the orphanage walls. Children were rarely seen playing in the yard, and when they did appear, they moved with the mechanical precision of soldiers rather than the natural exuberance of youth. The bell tower's bronze bell rang not just for prayer times, but throughout the day and night, its deep tolling becoming so frequent that townspeople began to complain about the noise disturbing their sleep. Local merchants who delivered supplies to the orphanage reported that the children they glimpsed seemed unusually quiet and pale, always supervised by one of the nuns, who watched their every movement with hawk-like intensity. When townspeople asked about visiting or touring the facilities, Father Kellerman politely but firmly explained that the children require a structured environment free from outside distractions to properly develop their moral character. The orphanage's reputation in the community remained positive throughout its first year of operation, but there were subtle signs that something was amiss. Dr. Thomas Whitmore, Millbrook's only physician, noted in his personal journal that he had never been called to treat any of the orphan children despite treating nearly every other child in town for various ailments. When he asked Father Kellerman about this, the priest explained that Sister Margaret Clare had extensive medical training and was fully capable of handling any health issues that arose. As winter approached in 1834, the townspeople began to notice that the number of children at the orphanage seemed to fluctuate in ways that didn't match the known arrivals. Some residents swore they had seen a particular child one week, only to never see them again. When asked about this, Sister Margaret Clare would simply explain that children come and go as God wills, and that many had been blessed with placement in loving homes far from here. The truth about what was happening behind the walls of Santa Eulalia Orphanage wouldn't begin to emerge for another decade. But the seeds of horror were already being planted in those first months of operation. The bronze bell continued to toll at all hours, the children remained pale and silent, and Father Kellerman's sermons grew increasingly focused on themes of sacrifice, obedience, and the purifying power of suffering. What the townspeople didn't know was that Father Kellerman had brought more than just theological training from his time in Bavaria. He had also absorbed certain medieval Catholic practices that the Church had officially abandoned centuries earlier, practices that he believed were necessary to save not just the souls of the orphaned children, but the souls of the entire community. In his private chambers, he kept detailed journals written in Latin, documenting what he called the sacred work of purification that he believed God had called him to perform. The stage was set for 17 years of horror that would remain hidden until long after the last child had disappeared from Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on a bitter January morning in 1835, when young Timothy Fletcher, the town's most reliable delivery boy, arrived at the orphanage with a wagon full of winter supplies. What he witnessed that day would haunt him for the rest of his life, though he wouldn't speak of it until he was on his deathbed 60 years later. Timothy had been making deliveries to the orphanage for months, always instructed to leave the goods at the service entrance and ring the bell once. Sister Bernadette would typically appear, sign for the delivery, and send him on his way with barely a word exchanged. But on this particular morning, the bitter cold had frozen the lock on the service door. and Timothy could hear what sounded like children crying from somewhere deep within the building. Concerned that the children might be in distress, Timothy walked around to the front entrance where he found the main door slightly ajar. The crying was louder now, mixed with what sounded like a woman's voice speaking in a language he didn't recognize. Following the sound, he stepped into the entrance hall, where the smell of burning candles mixed with something else, something medicinal and unpleasant that made his stomach turn. The crying was coming from the chapel, and as Timothy approached, he could see through the partially opened door what appeared to be a religious ceremony. Sister Margaret Clare stood at the altar, her back to the door, speaking in rapid Latin while holding what looked like a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. Around her, a group of children knelt in perfect silence, their heads bowed so low that their foreheads nearly touched the floor. What disturbed Timothy most was not the ceremony itself, but the children's appearance. Even from behind, he could see that their clothing was torn and dirty, their small bodies seemed unnaturally thin, and some appeared to be shaking, though whether from cold, fear, or illness he couldn't tell. The white bundle in Sister Margaret Clare's arms seemed to be moving slightly, and Timothy realized with growing horror that whatever was wrapped inside was alive. Suddenly, Sister Bernadette's voice cut through the chapel's silence. "Who dares to disturb the sacred work?" Timothy spun around to find the young nun standing directly behind him, her face twisted with rage he had never seen in any religious person. Her usually neat habit was disheveled, and her hands were stained with something dark that didn't look like ink. I brought the supplies," Timothy stammered, backing toward the door. The service entrance was frozen and I heard crying. "There is no crying here," Sister Bernadette said, her voice now eerily calm. "Only prayer, only the holy work of purification." She stepped closer to Timothy and he could smell something metallic on her breath. "You will leave now, and you will speak of this to no one. The work we do here is sacred, but it is not for the understanding of common people." Timothy nodded frantically and stumbled toward the door, but Sister Bernadette's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. "Swear it," she whispered. "Swear on your mother's grave that you will never speak of what you think you saw here." "I swear," Timothy gasped, and the nun released him. He ran from the orphanage without looking back, leaving the wagon of supplies in the snow outside the front door. That night, Timothy's mother found him in their barn, sitting in the hayloft and staring at nothing with wide, frightened eyes. When she asked what was wrong, he simply said that he never wanted to make another delivery to the orphanage. She assumed he had been frightened by the strict nuns and agreed to send his older brother in his place. But Timothy's terror went far deeper than fear of stern religious women. What he had witnessed in the chapel would replay in his mind for decades. The unnatural silence of the children, the way they knelt as if their very lives depended on perfect stillness, and most disturbing of all, the way Sister Margaret Clare had held that white bundle as if it contained something precious and terrible at the same time. The next day, Father Kellerman visited the Fletcher family personally, something he had never done before. He spoke privately with Timothy for nearly an hour, and when he left, the boy seemed even more disturbed than before. He began having nightmares that made him scream in the night, and he developed a stutter that wouldn't disappear for months. Mrs. Fletcher, a devout Lutheran, tried to comfort her son by reminding him that Catholics had different ways of worship, but Timothy would only shake his head and whisper, "It wasn't worship, Mama. It was something else." When pressed to explain what he meant, he would fall silent and refuse to say another word. The delivery to the orphanage was taken over by Timothy's brother Marcus, but even he began to report strange occurrences. He noticed that the number of children visible through the windows seemed to change from week to week, and he swore that he sometimes heard singing coming from the basement, though Sister Margaret Clare insisted the building had no basement. Most disturbing of all, he began finding small items scattered around the orphanage grounds, a child's shoe, a torn piece of fabric, a wooden toy carved in the shape of a cross. When Marcus asked Sister Bernadette about these items, she would gather them up quickly and explain that children are careless with their possessions. But Marcus noticed that the items never seemed to match the clothing or belongings of the children he could see through the windows. Dr. Whitmore, the town physician, began to take notice of the strange reports coming from the orphanage. His medical training had made him naturally observant, and he started keeping detailed notes about the inconsistencies in the stories told by the delivery boys and the few other townspeople who had occasion to visit the building. What troubled him most was the complete absence of any requests for medical assistance. In his 30 years of practice, Dr. Whitmore had never encountered a group of children who didn't require at least occasional medical attention. When he offered his services free of charge to the orphanage, Father Kellerman declined politely but firmly, explaining that the children are blessed with exceptional health, and Sister Margaret Clare has all the medical knowledge necessary for their care. This explanation might have satisfied the townspeople, but Dr. Whitmore knew enough about medicine to recognize that no group of children, especially orphans who had likely suffered from malnutrition and exposure before arriving at the orphanage, could maintain perfect health without professional medical intervention. He began to suspect that either the children were not actually healthy, or they were not actually there. The first real evidence that something was seriously wrong came in the spring of 1835, when a traveling merchant named Jacob Reinhardt arrived in Millbrook with a disturbing story. Reinhardt claimed that while passing through a town 50 miles east, he had encountered a young girl begging on the streets who told him she had escaped from the place with the bell that never stops ringing. The girl, who appeared to be about 10 years old, had fresh scars on her arms and spoke in terrified whispers about the sister who makes the children disappear. When Reinhardt asked the girl to explain what she meant, she became hysterical and ran away, but not before mentioning the name Santa Eulalia. Reinhardt, who was Catholic himself, was disturbed enough by the encounter to make inquiries about the orphanage when he reached Millbrook. He was told that Santa Eulalia was a model institution doing God's work, but something in the townspeople's responses made him suspect they were trying to convince themselves as much as him. Father Kellerman learned of Reinhardt's inquiries and visited the merchant at his inn that very evening. Their conversation was private, but the innkeeper later reported that he heard raised voices and what sounded like threats being made. The next morning, Reinhardt left town without completing his planned business transactions, and he never returned to Millbrook. The incident with the merchant marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for years. Anyone who asked too many questions about the orphanage would receive a visit from Father Kellerman, after which they would either fall silent or leave town entirely. The priest seemed to have an uncanny ability to know exactly who was talking about the orphanage and what they were saying. But the most disturbing development came later that spring, when the bronze bell in the orphanage tower began ringing at increasingly strange hours. The bell, which had previously rung only for prayer times and meals, now tolled at midnight, at 3 in the morning, and sometimes continuously for hours during the day. When townspeople complained about the noise, Father Kellerman explained that the bell was being used to mark the sacred hours of prayer and contemplation. Dr. Whitmore, however, recognized the pattern of the bell's ringing. In his medical studies, he had learned about the psychological effects of sleep deprivation and constant noise on the human mind. The pattern of the bell's tolling seemed designed not to call people to prayer, but to prevent anyone from sleeping soundly. He began to wonder if the bell was being used as a form of psychological torture, though he couldn't understand why anyone would want to torture children. The summer of 1835 brought the first disappearance that couldn't be explained away. 8-year-old Anna Dietrich, whose parents had died in a cholera outbreak, had been brought to the orphanage by her aunt in the spring. The aunt, Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, had been promised that she could visit her niece once a month to ensure her welfare. But when she arrived for her second visit, she was told that Anna had been placed with a loving family in Baltimore and would not be returning. Mrs. Hoffman demanded to know the identity of this family so she could maintain contact with her niece. But Sister Margaret Clare claimed that the adoptive family had requested complete privacy. When Mrs. Hoffman insisted on seeing some documentation of the adoption, she was told that all such records were confidential church property. Suspicious and increasingly desperate, Mrs. Hoffman refused to leave the orphanage without more information about her niece. She began questioning the other children, but they seemed terrified to speak to her. When she pressed them, they would only whisper that Anna had gone to the quiet place, and that they hoped they would never have to go there too. The confrontation escalated when Mrs. Hoffman demanded to search the entire building for her niece. Father Kellerman arrived and, in front of several witnesses, had her physically removed from the property by two men he claimed were protectors of the church. Mrs. Hoffman left Millbrook that day and never returned, but she spent the rest of her life writing letters to church authorities, demanding an investigation into what had happened to her niece. By the end of 1835, the pattern had become clear to anyone willing to see it. Children arrived at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. They were rarely seen or heard from again, and anyone who asked too many questions was either silenced or driven away. The bronze bell continued to toll at all hours. The children who could be glimpsed through the windows grew thinner and paler, and Father Kellerman's sermons became increasingly focused on themes of sacrifice, purification, and the need for absolute obedience to God's will. The townspeople wanted to believe that they were witnessing a great work of charity. But deep in their hearts, they were beginning to suspect that something far more sinister was happening behind the walls of Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The question was whether anyone would have the courage to discover the truth before it was too late for the 93 children who had entered those doors. The winter of 1835 brought changes to Santa Eulalia Orphanage that even the most willfully ignorant townspeople could no longer dismiss. The building itself seemed to take on a malevolent presence, its tall windows glowing with candlelight at all hours, while shadows moved behind the glass in patterns that suggested activities far more disturbing than simple prayer or study. Sister Catherine, the youngest of the three nuns, had begun to show signs of severe psychological distress. Those who encountered her during her increasingly rare trips to town noticed that she had developed a pronounced tremor in her hands and would flinch violently at sudden noises. Her once bright eyes had taken on a haunted quality, and she had lost so much weight that her habit hung loose on her frame like a burial shroud. Dr. Whitmore, whose medical curiosity had evolved into genuine concern, began documenting these changes in his private journal. He wrote, "Sister Catherine appears to be suffering from what I can only describe as a form of nervous exhaustion, typically seen in soldiers who have witnessed prolonged combat. The question that haunts me is, what war is being fought within the walls of that orphanage?" The answer came in fragments, whispered confessions from Sister Catherine during her few interactions with townspeople. To Mrs. Mary Patterson, the baker's wife, she muttered, "The children, they try to be so good, but it's never enough. It's never enough for her." When Mrs. Patterson asked what she meant, Sister Catherine's eyes filled with tears and she whispered, "Sister Margaret Clare says that suffering purifies the soul, but I fear we are not purifying anything. We are destroying it." These cryptic statements began to paint a picture of systematic abuse being carried out under the guise of religious discipline. Father Kellerman had developed what he called the sacred method, a program of spiritual purification that he claimed was based on ancient Catholic practices, but was actually his own twisted interpretation of medieval monastic discipline, combined with his growing obsession with the concept of child martyrdom. The sacred method involved what Father Kellerman described as graduated trials of faith that were designed to strip away the children's worldly attachments and prepare their souls for direct communion with God. These trials began with extreme fasting, moved through various forms of physical penance, and culminated in what he called the final purification, a process that Sister Catherine's fragmented confessions suggested was far more sinister than mere prayer. The bronze bell played a central role in this system of control. Its constant tolling was not just a call to prayer, but a psychological conditioning tool that trained the children to respond immediately to any sound with absolute obedience. The irregular timing of the bell, sometimes silent for hours, sometimes ringing continuously, created a state of constant anxiety that made the children desperate to please their caretakers in hopes of earning moments of peace. Local merchant Samuel Crane, who had been delivering food supplies to the orphanage for over a year, began to notice disturbing patterns in the types and quantities of food being ordered. The amounts seemed far too small to feed the number of children that the orphanage supposedly housed, and the types of food suggested a diet so restrictive that it bordered on deliberate starvation. When he questioned Sister Bernadette about this, she explained that The children are learning to find nourishment in prayer rather than earthly sustenance. More troubling still were the special orders that began arriving from Philadelphia, medical supplies that seemed more suited to a hospital than an orphanage. These included large quantities of laudanum, surgical instruments, and chemicals that Dr. Whitmore recognized as embalming fluids. When he inquired about these supplies, he was told that Sister Margaret Clare was conducting advanced medical research that had been approved by the church. The truth about Sister Margaret Clare's background began to emerge through correspondence with other religious institutions. She had not, as she claimed, trained with the Sisters of Mercy in Ireland. Instead, she had been expelled from a convent in France for what church records described as theological irregularities and dangerous innovations in the treatment of children. She had arrived in America under an assumed name and had somehow convinced Father Kellerman that she was a qualified educator and medical practitioner. In reality, Sister Margaret Clare had developed her own heretical interpretation of Catholic doctrine that combined elements of extreme asceticism with what could only be described as a form of religious sadism. She believed that children, being naturally innocent, had the greatest capacity for spiritual purification through suffering, and that by subjecting them to increasingly severe trials, she could transform them into perfect vessels for God's grace. The children who survived these trials were, according to her twisted theology, blessed with a spiritual purity that elevated them above ordinary human existence. Those who did not survive were considered to have achieved the ultimate purification, martyrdom, and were allegedly given special burials in what she called the sacred ground beneath the orphanage. Timothy Fletcher, the delivery boy who had witnessed the strange ceremony in the chapel, began to experience dreams that seemed more like memories than imagination. In these dreams he saw children kneeling in perfect silence while Sister Margaret Clare performed rituals that involved marking their bodies with religious symbols and forcing them to consume substances that made them violently ill. He dreamed of a hidden room beneath the chapel, where small wooden crosses were carved with names and dates, and where the smell of earth mixed with something sweet and terrible. These dreams became so vivid and disturbing that Timothy began to question whether he had actually seen more than he remembered during his brief visit to the orphanage. He started to wonder if his mind had protected him from the full horror of what he had witnessed by blocking out the most traumatic memories. The first concrete evidence of the orphanage's true nature came in the spring of 1836, when a construction worker named Patrick O'Brien was hired to repair the roof of the bell tower. O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had worked on many church buildings, was skilled at moving quietly through religious spaces without disrupting the occupants. His job required him to access the tower through a narrow staircase that ran along the interior wall of the building, giving him an unexpected view into several rooms that were normally hidden from public view. What O'Brien saw during his week of work on the tower changed his life forever. Through the windows of what appeared to be a dormitory, he witnessed Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called morning purification, a ritual that involved forcing the children to kneel naked on the cold wooden floor while she examined their bodies for signs of spiritual impurity. Those who showed any sign of illness, injury, or even normal childhood curiosity were marked with ash on their foreheads and led away to a room that O'Brien never saw them leave. More disturbing still was what O'Brien observed in the basement of the building, which Sister Margaret Clare had claimed didn't exist. Through a small window at ground level, he could see a room that appeared to be set up as a primitive medical facility, complete with a wooden table, surgical instruments, and jars containing what looked like human organs preserved in fluid. The walls were covered with detailed anatomical drawings that seemed to focus on the internal structure of children's bodies. O'Brien was a devout Catholic who had immigrated to America to escape religious persecution, but what he saw at Santa Eulalia Orphanage shook his faith to its core. He struggled with the question of whether he should report what he had seen to the authorities, knowing that doing so might bring persecution upon the entire Catholic community in Millbrook. His decision was made for him when he witnessed what he later described as the most terrible thing a human being can see. On his final day of work, while adjusting the bell mechanism in the tower, he heard singing coming from the basement. Following the sound, he discovered a hidden entrance to the underground room and found Sister Margaret Clare conducting what she called the final purification on a young boy who couldn't have been more than 7 years old. The boy was lying on the wooden table, his small body marked with religious symbols that had been cut into his skin with surgical precision. He was conscious but appeared to be in a state of extreme euphoria, most likely from the laudanum that Sister Margaret Clare was administering to him through a cloth held over his nose. She was singing a Latin hymn while using her surgical instruments to remove what she described as the physical barriers to spiritual transcendence. O'Brien realized with growing horror that he was witnessing not a medical procedure, but a ritualistic murder being carried out in the name of religious purification. The boy's body showed signs of other injuries that had been inflicted over time, scars from previous purifications that had been designed to gradually break down his physical form until his soul could be released to join God in paradise. Unable to watch any longer, O'Brien burst into the room and confronted Sister Margaret Clare. She showed no shame or surprise at being discovered, but instead invited him to witness what she called the moment of greatest spiritual beauty, the child's death. She explained that the boy had been chosen for this honor because he had achieved a level of spiritual purity that made him worthy of martyrdom. O'Brien grabbed the child from the table and ran from the building, but it was too late. The boy died in his arms before he could reach Dr. Whitmore's office, his last words being a whispered prayer in Latin that Sister Margaret Clare had taught him to recite during his final moments. The death of this unnamed child marked the beginning of the end for Santa Eulalia Orphanage, but it would take another 15 years before the full scope of the horror would be revealed. O'Brien's testimony would eventually lead to an investigation that would uncover the truth about what had happened to the 93 children who had entered those doors. But first, he would have to survive the consequences of challenging an institution that had grown powerful enough to silence anyone who threatened its dark work. Patrick O'Brien's confrontation with Sister Margaret Clare set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately expose the truth about Santa Eulalia Orphanage, but not before the institution and its supporters fought desperately to maintain their deadly secret. The construction worker's decision to save the dying child had been brave, but it had also made him a target for forces more powerful and ruthless than he had imagined. Within hours of O'Brien's escape from the orphanage, Father Kellerman arrived at the construction site where the Irishman was supposed to be working. When told that O'Brien had left suddenly without completing his contract, the priest's reaction was swift and decisive. He claimed that O'Brien had stolen valuable church property and convinced the local sheriff to issue a warrant for his arrest. But O'Brien had anticipated this response. Instead of fleeing Millbrook, he had gone directly to Dr. Whitmore's office with a dying child, knowing that the physician's medical expertise would be crucial in documenting what had been done to the boy. Dr. Whitmore's examination revealed evidence of systematic torture that had been carried out over a period of weeks, possibly months. The child's body showed signs of deliberate starvation, ritualistic cutting, and the administration of drugs that had been designed to induce religious visions and compliance. Most disturbing of all, Dr. Whitmore discovered that the boy's internal organs had been systematically damaged in ways that suggested someone with medical knowledge had been conducting experiments on his living body. The pattern of injuries was consistent with what Dr. Whitmore had read about in medieval accounts of religious extremists who believed that physical suffering could accelerate spiritual purification. Dr. Whitmore immediately documented his findings and sent copies of his report to medical colleagues in Philadelphia and New York, ensuring that the evidence would survive even if he were silenced. He also provided O'Brien with a detailed medical report that could be used to support any legal proceedings against the orphanage. However, the reach of Santa Eulalia Orphanage's influence extended far beyond Millbrook. Within days of Dr. Whitmore's report being sent, he received visits from representatives of the Diocese of Philadelphia who claimed that O'Brien was a known criminal and that his accusations against the orphanage were part of a conspiracy to discredit the Catholic Church. They brought with them what appeared to be official documentation showing that O'Brien had been convicted of theft and fraud in Ireland before immigrating to America. The documents were forgeries, but they were sophisticated enough to convince local authorities who were already uncomfortable with the idea of investigating a religious institution. The sheriff, who had been under pressure from prominent Catholic families to arrest O'Brien, used the forged documents as justification to issue a warrant for the construction workers' arrest on charges of theft, fraud, and making false accusations against a religious institution. O'Brien was forced to flee Millbrook, but not before he had shared his story with several trusted individuals, including Timothy Fletcher, who had finally found the courage to speak about what he had witnessed in the orphanage chapel. The two men's testimonies corroborated each other in ways that made it impossible to dismiss their accounts as mere fantasy or malicious lies. Timothy's mother, Mrs. Fletcher, had initially been reluctant to believe her son's story, but O'Brien's detailed account of what he had seen convinced her that Timothy had been telling the truth all along. She began to understand that her son's nightmares and behavioral changes had been caused by witnessing genuine horror, not by an overactive imagination. Mrs. Fletcher made a decision that would prove crucial to the eventual exposure of the orphanage's crimes. She began secretly documenting everything she could learn about the institution, keeping detailed records of the children who had been brought there, the inconsistencies in the stories told by the nuns, and the strange occurrences that townspeople had reported over the years. Her investigation revealed patterns that were even more disturbing than O'Brien's eyewitness account had suggested. The number of children who had allegedly been placed with loving families was far higher than could be explained by normal adoption rates, and none of these families could be located or verified. The orphanage's financial records, which she obtained through her husband's connections with local merchants, showed payments for supplies that suggested the institution was housing far fewer children than it claimed. Most significant of all, Mrs. Fletcher discovered that Sister Margaret Clare had been corresponding with individuals in Europe who shared her twisted theological views. These letters, which she obtained through a contact in the postal service, revealed that the orphanage was part of a network of religious extremists who believed that child martyrdom was the highest form of spiritual achievement. The letters described in disturbing detail the methods that Sister Margaret Clare had developed for what she called the systematic purification of innocent souls. These methods were based on her belief that children who died in a state of artificially induced spiritual ecstasy would immediately ascend to heaven and become powerful intercessors for the souls of the living. According to her correspondence, Sister Margaret Clare had successfully purified 37 children during her first 2 years at the orphanage, and she was planning to expand her operations to include children from other institutions. She wrote about her experiments with different combinations of drugs, surgical procedures, and psychological techniques that could induce the religious visions and compliance necessary for what she called voluntary martyrdom. The letters also revealed that Father Kellerman was not just complicit in these activities, but was actually the intellectual architect of the entire system. His theological training had led him to develop a complex justification for child murder that was based on a twisted interpretation of Catholic doctrine about the nature of innocence and salvation. Father Kellerman believed that children who died before they could be corrupted by the world would automatically enter heaven. But he had taken this belief to its logical extreme by arguing that deliberately killing innocent children was actually the highest form of charity possible. He saw himself as a modern-day Abraham, called by God to sacrifice children for the greater good of humanity. The correspondence also revealed that the orphanage had been receiving financial support from wealthy Catholics who believed they were funding a legitimate charitable institution. These benefactors had no idea that their donations were being used to purchase the drugs, surgical instruments, and other materials necessary for the systematic murder of children. As Mrs. Fletcher's investigation progressed, she began to understand the full scope of the horror that had been taking place at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. The institution had not been saving children. It had been systematically murdering them under the guise of religious purification. The 93 children who had entered those doors had not been adopted by loving families or sent to other institutions. They had been killed in ritualistic ceremonies that Sister Margaret Clare and Father Kellerman believed would guarantee their immediate ascension to heaven. But Mrs. Fletcher's investigation also revealed something even more disturbing: the network of supporters who had made these crimes possible. The orphanage had not operated in isolation, but as part of a broader conspiracy that included wealthy donors, corrupt church officials, and even some government authorities who had been bribed or threatened into silence. The evidence that Mrs. Fletcher had assembled was compelling, but she knew that presenting it to local authorities would be futile. The same forces that had driven O'Brien from town and discredited Dr. Whitmore's medical findings would simply destroy her evidence and silence her testimony. She needed to find a way to expose the truth that would be impossible to suppress or discredit. Her opportunity came in the winter of 1837, when a journalist named Edward Harrington arrived in Millbrook to investigate rumors about unusual activities at the orphanage. Harrington worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer and had built a reputation as a fearless investigator of corruption and abuse within religious institutions. He had heard whispers about Santa Eulalia from several sources, including Dr. Whitmore, who had managed to get word to him despite the efforts to silence his testimony. Harrington's investigation methods were more sophisticated than anything the orphanage's supporters had encountered before. Instead of confronting Father Kellerman directly or trying to gain access to the building, he began documenting the inconsistencies in the orphanage's public records and tracing the backgrounds of the key personnel. His research revealed that Father Kellerman had been expelled from his previous parish in Bavaria for what church records described as theological extremism and dangerous innovations in pastoral care. The priest had arrived in America under circumstances that suggested he had been fleeing some form of scandal or legal trouble in Europe. More significantly, Harrington discovered that Sister Margaret Clare was not actually a nun at all, but a former medical student who had been dismissed from university in Paris for conducting unauthorized experiments on cadavers. She had assumed the identity of a deceased Irish nun and had used forged credentials to gain admission to various religious institutions across Europe before ultimately making her way to America. The journalist's investigation also uncovered financial irregularities that suggested the orphanage was being used as a front for a much larger criminal operation. Large sums of money were being funneled through the institution from sources that could not be traced, and these funds were being used to purchase supplies and services that had nothing to do with caring for children. As Harrington's investigation progressed, he began to receive threats from anonymous sources warning him to abandon his research. These threats escalated from simple warnings to physical violence when unknown assailants attacked him outside his hotel room one night, beating him severely and warning him that he would be killed if he continued his investigation. But Harrington was not easily intimidated, and the attack only convinced him that he was on the right track. He began working with Mrs. Fletcher to compile a comprehensive dossier that would expose not just the crimes being committed at the orphanage, but the entire network of corruption that had made those crimes possible. Their collaboration produced a document that was devastating in its scope and detail. It included copies of the correspondence between Sister Margaret Clare and her European contacts, financial records showing the flow of money through the orphanage, medical evidence from Dr. Whitmore's examination of the murdered child, and testimony from multiple witnesses who had observed suspicious activities at the institution. Most damaging of all, the dossier included a detailed timeline that showed how the orphanage's operators had systematically eliminated anyone who had tried to expose their crimes. The document revealed that several individuals who had asked questions about the orphanage had died under mysterious circumstances, including Mrs. Elizabeth Hoffman, who had been found dead in a Baltimore hotel room just weeks after demanding information about her missing niece. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who can handle the darkest truths about America's hidden history. Just when we thought we'd uncovered the worst of what happened at Santa Eulalia, the investigation reveals a conspiracy that reaches far beyond one orphanage. If this story is sending chills down your spine, you're not alone. Thousands of brave souls in our community have chosen to face these uncomfortable truths together. Share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to help others discover this story, and subscribe to join our brotherhood of truth seekers. Because what we're about to reveal next will challenge everything you thought you knew about religious institutions in 19th century America. The winter of 1838 brought the investigation to its climax when Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher obtained the evidence they needed to prove beyond any doubt that Santa Eulalia Orphanage was a site of systematic child murder. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Sister Catherine, the youngest nun, who had been showing increasing signs of psychological distress since O'Brien's escape from the orphanage. The guilt and horror of what she had witnessed and participated in had finally become too much for her to bear, and she made contact with Mrs. Fletcher through an intermediary, expressing her willingness to provide testimony about what had really been happening behind the orphanage walls. Sister Catherine's confession, recorded in secret meetings over the course of several weeks, revealed details so horrifying that even Harrington, who had investigated numerous cases of institutional abuse, found himself struggling to maintain his professional composure. The young nun described in vivid detail the systematic process by which children were selected for what Sister Margaret Clare called purification, the ritualistic tortures that were inflicted upon them, and the methods used to dispose of their bodies. According to Sister Catherine's testimony, the selection process was based on Sister Margaret Clare's twisted assessment of each child's spiritual potential. Children who showed signs of rebellion, curiosity, or independent thinking were marked for early purification, as were those who became ill or showed any signs of physical weakness. The nun believed that these characteristics indicated souls that were struggling against divine will and therefore needed more intensive intervention. The purification process itself was conducted in the hidden basement room that O'Brien had discovered. But Sister Catherine revealed that there were actually several such rooms connected by tunnels that ran beneath the entire orphanage complex. These underground chambers had been designed to muffle sound and could be accessed through hidden entrances that were known only to Sister Margaret Clare and Father Kellerman. The children selected for purification were told that they had been chosen for a special honor, to become angels of intercession, who would pray for the souls of the living from their place in heaven. They were subjected to a gradual process of physical and psychological conditioning that was designed to break down their resistance and make them eager participants in their own deaths. This conditioning began with extreme fasting and sleep deprivation, followed by the administration of drugs that induced religious visions and feelings of euphoria. The children were taught special prayers and hymns that they were told would guarantee their immediate ascension to heaven, and they were shown religious artwork that depicted the glorious fate that awaited them after their transformation. The final stage of the process involved what Sister Margaret Clare called the sacred surgery, a series of ritualistic mutilations that were performed while the children were conscious but heavily drugged. These procedures were designed to cause maximum suffering while prolonging the dying process, as Sister Margaret Clare believed that the intensity of the child's pain was directly related to the spiritual power they would possess in the afterlife. Sister Catherine's description of these procedures was so detailed and disturbing that Harrington had to stop the interview several times to compose himself. The nun described how Sister Margaret Clare would sing hymns while cutting intricate religious symbols into the children's flesh, how she would force them to recite prayers while removing their internal organs, and how she would hold their hands and whisper comforting words as they died in agony. The bodies of the murdered children were disposed of in a mass grave that had been dug beneath the orphanage's chapel. Sister Catherine revealed that the wooden crosses that would later be discovered by construction workers had been placed there by Sister Margaret Clare as a form of record-keeping. Each cross marked another soul that had been purified and sent to heaven to intercede for the orphanage's mission. But Sister Catherine's most shocking revelation concerned the scope of the conspiracy that had enabled these crimes. She revealed that Father Kellerman had been in regular communication with church officials in Philadelphia who were fully aware of what was happening at the orphanage and had actually provided theological guidance for the murders. These officials, according to Sister Catherine, had convinced themselves that the orphanage was conducting a form of religious research that would ultimately benefit the entire Catholic Church. They believed that by studying the effects of extreme suffering on the human soul, they could develop new methods of spiritual purification that would help ordinary Catholics achieve higher levels of sanctity. The conspiracy extended beyond the church hierarchy to include several wealthy Catholic families who had been told that they were funding a secret missionary project that was too sensitive to be discussed publicly. These families had provided the financial resources necessary to purchase the drugs, surgical instruments, and other materials used in the murders, believing that they were supporting the conversion of Native Americans or some other legitimate religious endeavor. Sister Catherine also revealed that the orphanage had been used as a training ground for individuals who would go on to establish similar institutions in other parts of the country. She described meetings where Sister Margaret Clare had taught her methods to visitors from other states, and she provided names and locations that suggested a network of such institutions might already be operating throughout America. The implications of Sister Catherine's testimony were staggering. If her information was accurate, Santa Eulalia Orphanage was not an isolated case of religious extremism, but part of a systematic program of child murder that was being carried out with the knowledge and support of powerful religious and secular authorities. Harrington knew that publishing Sister Catherine's testimony would require extraordinary precautions, as the forces arrayed against him were far more powerful and ruthless than he had initially realized. He began making arrangements to simultaneously release his story through multiple newspapers in different cities, ensuring that the truth could not be suppressed by threatening or bribing a single publisher. But as he prepared for publication, Harrington discovered that his investigation had attracted the attention of individuals who were willing to use any means necessary to protect the conspiracy. His hotel room was searched while he was out, his notes were stolen from a supposedly secure location, and he received increasingly specific threats that convinced him his life was in immediate danger. The situation reached a crisis point when Sister Catherine failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Harrington and Mrs. Fletcher. When they went to the orphanage to check on her welfare, they were told that she had been transferred to another institution for medical treatment related to her psychological condition. In reality, Sister Catherine had been discovered by Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare, who had realized that she was providing information to outside investigators. The young nun had been subjected to the same purification process that had been inflicted on the children, though her death had been made to look like suicide, brought on by religious melancholy. The murder of Sister Catherine marked the point at which the conspiracy began to unravel. Her death had been too suspicious and too convenient to be explained away as natural causes, and it provided Harrington with the final piece of evidence he needed to demonstrate that the orphanage's operators were willing to kill anyone who threatened their operation. With Sister Catherine's testimony in hand and evidence of her murder to support his claims, Harrington was ready to publish his exposé. But he knew that doing so would trigger a violent response from the conspiracy supporters, and he began making preparations to protect himself and his sources from retaliation. The journalist's final investigation revealed that the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of both church and government, involving individuals who had the power to destroy evidence, intimidate witnesses, and even order murders to protect their secret. The stakes had risen far beyond the question of what had happened to the children at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. They now involved a struggle for the soul of American religious institutions and the rule of law itself. As Harrington prepared to publish his story, he knew that he was about to trigger events that would either expose one of the most horrific conspiracies in American history or result in his own death and the permanent burial of the truth about the 93 children who had died at Santa Eulalia Orphanage. On March 15, 1839, Edward Harrington's exposé appeared simultaneously in newspapers across 5 states, creating a media sensation that could not be suppressed or discredited by the conspiracy's supporters. The story, titled "The Angels of Santa Eulalia," an investigation into systematic child murder in Pennsylvania, presented evidence so compelling and well documented that it immediately triggered federal investigations and prompted congressional hearings into corruption within religious institutions. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours of the story's publication, angry crowds had gathered outside Santa Eulalia Orphanage, demanding answers about the children who had supposedly been placed with adoptive families. Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare, realizing that their operation had been exposed, attempted to flee under cover of darkness, but they were apprehended by federal marshals who had been mobilized to prevent the destruction of evidence. The search of the orphanage complex revealed horrors that exceeded even Sister Catherine's detailed testimony. The hidden basement chambers contained not just surgical instruments and drug supplies, but detailed records of every child who had been murdered, including sketches of the ritualistic mutilations that had been inflicted upon them and transcripts of their final words as they died. Most shocking of all was the discovery of Sister Margaret Clare's private journal, written in a mixture of Latin and German, which revealed the true scope of her madness. The journal described her belief that she was conducting a form of divine experiment designed to determine the exact conditions necessary for human souls to achieve immediate sanctification. She had kept meticulous records of how different combinations of physical torture, psychological manipulation, and drug administration affected the children's behavior during their final moments. The journal also revealed that Sister Margaret Clare had convinced herself that the murdered children were actually appearing to her in visions, thanking her for their purification and providing guidance for her continued work. She believed that she was building an army of child saints who would eventually intercede with God to bring about a new age of spiritual purification for all humanity. Father Kellerman's confession, obtained under interrogation by federal investigators, revealed the theological framework that had justified these atrocities. He explained that he had developed his theories about child martyrdom during his studies in Bavaria, where he had encountered medieval texts describing similar practices among certain heretical sects. He had convinced himself that the Catholic Church's official condemnation of such practices was based on political considerations rather than genuine theological objections. The priest's confession also exposed the network of supporters who had made the orphanage's operation possible. He provided names and details about church officials, wealthy donors, and government authorities who had knowingly participated in the conspiracy. The scope of the corruption was so extensive that it ultimately led to resignations, criminal prosecutions, and reforms within multiple institutions. The excavation of the mass grave beneath the orphanage chapel confirmed the full extent of the horror. The remains of 93 children were recovered, their bones showing evidence of the systematic torture that had been inflicted upon them. The wooden crosses that construction workers would later discover had been placed there by Sister Margaret Clare as a form of monument to her victims, each one carefully carved with the child's name and the date of their purification. The forensic examination of these remains provided gruesome confirmation of Sister Catherine's testimony. The children had been subjected to prolonged torture that had been designed to maximize their suffering while keeping them alive as long as possible. The pattern of injuries was consistent with someone who possessed both medical knowledge and a complete lack of human compassion. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a hidden room that contained what appeared to be Sister Margaret Clare's long-term plans for expanding her operation. The room contained detailed maps showing potential locations for new orphanages throughout the American frontier, correspondence with individuals in Europe who shared her beliefs, and financial projections for what she called the systematic purification of America's unwanted children. These documents revealed that Sister Margaret Clare had viewed Santa Eulalia Orphanage as merely the first step in a much larger project. She had been planning to establish a network of such institutions that would process thousands of children per year, creating what she believed would be the largest group of martyred saints in Christian history. The investigation also uncovered evidence that several children had actually survived the orphanage's operation, having been rescued or escaped before they could be selected for purification. These survivors, now adults, began coming forward with their own testimonies about the horrors they had witnessed and endured. Their accounts filled in crucial details about daily life within the orphanage and confirmed that the systematic abuse had been even more extensive than the physical evidence suggested. The children had been subjected to psychological torture that was designed to break their will and make them grateful for the opportunity to die for God's glory. One survivor, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had escaped from the orphanage in 1840 at the age of 12, described how the children had been forced to participate in mock funeral services for their fellow inmates, singing hymns of thanksgiving as their friends were taken away to be murdered. He recalled how Sister Margaret Clare would tell the children that those who had been purified were now living in paradise, and that they should feel jealous rather than sad about their friends' fate. Another survivor, Mary O'Sullivan, who had been rescued from the orphanage by relatives who had become suspicious about the institution's operations, described the systematic starvation and drug administration that had been used to weaken the children's resistance. She recalled how the children had been taught to view their suffering as a privilege and to compete with each other for the honor of being selected for purification. These testimonies painted a picture of an institution that had operated as a combination of concentration camp, medical laboratory, and religious cult. The children had been systematically dehumanized and conditioned to accept their own murder as a form of divine blessing. The trial of Father Kellerman and Sister Margaret Clare became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the 19th century, attracting international attention and prompting widespread discussions about the need for oversight of religious institutions. The evidence presented during the trial was so overwhelming that both defendants were convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to death. Sister Margaret Clare showed no remorse for her crimes, maintaining until her execution that she had been doing God's work, and that her victims were now among the most blessed souls in heaven. Father Kellerman, by contrast, appeared to suffer a complete psychological breakdown during the trial, alternately claiming that he had been deceived by Sister Margaret Clare and insisting that their actions had been justified by divine revelation. The exposure of the Santa Eulalia conspiracy had far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the prosecution of the individuals directly involved. The scandal prompted congressional investigations into the oversight of religious institutions, led to new laws requiring government inspection of orphanages and other child care facilities, and sparked a broader national conversation about the potential for abuse within religious organizations. The Catholic Church, which had initially attempted to distance itself from the scandal, was ultimately forced to acknowledge that some of its officials had been complicit in the conspiracy. This led to significant reforms within the church hierarchy and new procedures for monitoring the activities of religious institutions that served vulnerable populations. The demolition of Santa Eulalia Orphanage in 1887, nearly 50 years after the exposure of its crimes, marked the final chapter in one of the most disturbing episodes in American religious history. The building had stood empty since 1839, too tainted by its history to serve any legitimate purpose, gradually deteriorating as nature reclaimed the site where 93 children had died in the name of religious purification. The discovery of the wooden crosses during the demolition process provided a haunting reminder of the individual lives that had been lost to Sister Margaret Clare's madness. Each cross represented not just a victim, but a child who had entered the orphanage with hopes for a better life, and had instead encountered systematic torture and murder carried out by those who claimed to represent God's love. The investigation that followed the scandal had revealed that the conspiracy extended far beyond the walls of the orphanage itself. 23 individuals were ultimately prosecuted for their roles in the operation, including church officials, wealthy donors, and government authorities who had either actively participated in the crimes or helped to cover them up. The trials generated thousands of pages of testimony that provided a comprehensive record of how institutional corruption and religious extremism had combined to create conditions that enabled mass murder. Dr. Whitmore, whose early suspicions had been vindicated by the investigation, spent his remaining years documenting the psychological and medical aspects of the case. His detailed analysis of the murders became a landmark study in criminal psychology and helped establish new standards for investigating crimes involving systematic abuse of children. Edward Harrington, the journalist whose investigation had exposed the conspiracy, went on to become one of America's most respected investigative reporters. He spent the rest of his career documenting corruption and abuse within powerful institutions, always mindful of the lesson he had learned at Santa Eulalia, that ordinary people's willingness to ignore uncomfortable truths can enable extraordinary evil. Mrs. Fletcher, whose determination to uncover the truth had been crucial to the investigation's success, became an advocate for child welfare reform. She worked with legislators to establish new oversight mechanisms for orphanages and other institutions serving children, ensuring that the safeguards necessary to prevent another Santa Eulalia would be built into the legal system. The survivors of the orphanage faced varying degrees of success in rebuilding their lives after their rescue. Some, like Thomas Brennan and Mary O'Sullivan, were able to overcome their traumatic experiences and lead productive lives, often becoming advocates for other abuse survivors. Others struggled for years with the psychological damage inflicted by their experiences, and several ultimately died by suicide, unable to escape the memories of what they had endured. The long-term impact of the Santa Eulalia scandal extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. The case prompted fundamental changes in how American society approached the oversight of religious institutions and the protection of vulnerable children. New laws required regular government inspection of orphanages, established mandatory reporting requirements for suspected abuse, and created legal mechanisms for removing children from dangerous situations. The scandal also had significant theological implications for American Christianity. The case forced religious leaders to confront the potential for their own beliefs to be twisted into justifications for evil, and it sparked important discussions about the balance between religious freedom and public safety. Perhaps most importantly, the exposure of the Santa Eulalia conspiracy demonstrated that even the most powerful institutions could be held accountable for their crimes if ordinary citizens were willing to seek the truth and demand justice. The investigation had succeeded not because of the efforts of any single individual, but because multiple people, from construction workers to doctors to journalists to concerned parents, had chosen to act on their suspicions rather than look the other way. The site where Santa Eulalia Orphanage once stood remained empty for decades after the building's demolition. Local residents avoided the area, claiming that it felt cursed or haunted, though whether this was due to genuine supernatural phenomena or simply the psychological impact of knowing what had happened there remains a matter of debate. In 1934, nearly a century after the orphanage's crimes were exposed, the town of Millbrook erected a memorial on the site to honor the memory of the 93 children who had died there. The memorial consists of a simple granite stone engraved with the names of all the victims, surrounded by a small garden where visitors can leave flowers or say prayers. The inscription on the memorial reads, "In memory of 93 innocent souls whose lives were taken by those who claimed to serve God. May their deaths serve as a reminder that we must never allow faith to be used as a justification for cruelty, and that we must always be vigilant against those who would harm the vulnerable in the name of righteousness." Today, the Santa Eulalia case is studied in law schools, seminaries, and psychology programs as an example of how institutional corruption and religious extremism can combine to create conditions that enable systematic abuse. The detailed records from the investigation continue to provide insights into the psychology of both perpetrators and victims of institutional abuse. The case also serves as a reminder that the protection of vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance from ordinary citizens. The children who died at Santa Eulalia Orphanage were failed not just by the individuals who murdered them, but by a community that chose to ignore warning signs and avoid asking uncomfortable questions. The bronze bell that once tolled at all hours from the orphanage's tower was melted down after the building's demolition, its metal used to cast a new bell for Millbrook's Lutheran Church. The new bell rings only for traditional church services and special occasions, its clear, pure tone serving as a symbol of redemption and hope in a community that had learned the hard way about the price of willful blindness. This mystery shows us that evil can hide behind the most sacred facades, and that institutions claiming to serve God can sometimes become instruments of unspeakable cruelty. The 93 children of Santa Eulalia Orphanage died not because of supernatural forces or inexplicable evil, but because human beings chose to prioritize their own beliefs, comfort, and social standing over the welfare of vulnerable children. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that all the truth about Santa Eulalia was revealed? Or might there be other secrets still buried in America's religious history? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about how communities can better protect vulnerable children from institutional abuse. If you enjoyed this dark chapter of American history and want more stories that reveal the hidden horrors behind sacred walls, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who isn't afraid to confront uncomfortable truths. Remember, only by acknowledging the darkness of the past can we hope to build a brighter future. See you in the next video, where we'll explore another mystery that challenges everything you thought you knew about America's religious institutions.